Hey everyone, throughout history, the need for advantage in battles has spurred on the invention of some of the most truly bizarre and innovative weaponry. Whether born out of desperation, wishful thinking, or just plain stupidity, I'm counting down the 15 most unusual weapons ever made. Starting with number 15, bat bombs. Setting aside the ethics for a moment, everything about this first weapon is just plain crazy. Bat bombs were exactly as they sound, a weapon where bombs were attached to live bats in an effort to blow things up. These bat bombs came about during World War II. They were classified as an experimental weapon, and they were developed by the United States military as part of something called Project X-Ray. It is a bizarre concept, to say the least, but it basically involved attaching incendiary bombs to bats and then releasing them over enemy targets. The intention was that the bats would roost in buildings and structures before the bombs detonated. Then, kaboom, widespread fires, destruction would then ensue. The inventor was actually a dentist named Lytle S. Adams. Apparently, when he wasn't cleaning teeth, he dabbled in inventions. He proposed this concept to the US government in 1942, and he claimed that his bat bombs would be a highly effective way of blowing up enemy targets. The bombs were glued onto the bats using a special adhesive. Then the bats were stuffed into these canisters and parachutes were fixed onto these canisters, and when they were dropped from airplanes, the canisters would open and the bats would be released. Then they would fly to wherever bats fly to, set up residence, and then just explode. The US military invested time and money into this project, however, it ultimately proved to be impractical. And apparently the bats were very unpredictable in their behavior and were really hard to train. Who knew? Well, why this is surprising to anyone is just kind of mind-boggling, but at the end of the day, they couldn't count on the bats to go where they needed them to go, so the project was canceled in 1944. Number 14, the man catcher. Need to catch a man? Well, good thing there's the man catcher, or at least there was. The man catcher, also known as a people catcher or catch pole, was a highly unusual weapon used in medieval Europe and later during the Renaissance period. The weapon was basically a large hinged pole with a semicircular or rectangular frame at one end. The frame was fitted with spikes or hooks, and the idea was to capture the person with the hooks, immobilizing them. Well, the weapon wasn't designed to cause any serious injury, although it looks like it might have occasionally. So who used this thing? Well, law enforcement, city guards, or anyone tasked with apprehending criminals. It was also used to catch rioters, and it allowed the user to catch anyone they wanted while they remained at a safe distance. Now, because it was designed to capture and not maim, the frame at the end of the pole was often padded or lined with leather. This was to minimize injury to the captured person, but don't worry, the spikes or hooks held them securely in place. The man catcher varied in size and design, and some versions featured a circular frame meant to capture the torso or the limbs, while others had a rectangular frame which was for the shoulder or neck. Some man catchers even included a locking mechanism, so once ensnared in the man catcher's hooks, the captive wasn't going anywhere. The man catcher is a pretty obscure weapon, but it did have some benefits. However, I'm not so sure it would fly today. Hooking people with a ghastly-looking weapon and ensnaring them on giant claws is generally frowned upon. But perhaps this is what led to the evolution of handcuffs. Number 13, the Davey Crockett nuclear weapon. The name says it all for this one, a nuclear weapon named after American folk hero Davey Crockett. To call this weapon unusual really doesn't do it justice. So what is it? Well, it's one of the smallest nuclear weapon systems ever built. It was designed to be fired from a portable launcher by a small team of soldiers. So that pretty much sums it up, a nuclear weapon designed to be easy to use. Well, the Davey Crockett nuclear weapon was developed by the United States during the Cold War era. It was developed in the late 1950s by U.S. Army as a part of its efforts to provide infantry units with nuclear capabilities for battlefield use. It sounds pretty logical. It was portable and small. The warhead itself had a yield of around 10 to 20 tons of TNT equivalent, making it a fairly low yield by nuclear standards. However, don't let those numbers fool you. It's still a nuclear weapon. It could be launched from either a recoilless rifle or a tripod-mounted launcher, had a range of up to 1.25 miles. The weapon measured at around 30 inches in length and weighed approximately 76 pounds. It could be carried by a small team of soldiers to the battlefield, but despite its size, it's important to note that this was still a fully functioning nuclear weapon. It produced a significant blast and radiation effect, and it was meant to be used in close combat situations, where it clearly had the upper hand on conventional weapons. This weapon would have been primarily deployed by the United States Army in Europe during the Cold War as part of NATO's defense strategy against a potential Soviet invasion. Its deployment, as all things in the Cold War, was meant to deter the enemy from aggression. It wasn't meant to be used as a weapon or first resort. Thankfully, it was never actually used, but the fact that this weapon even exists and that it was deployed, it's kind of terrifying. Well, from an unusual point of view, I guess it checks that box too. It's portable, mini nuke to be used on the battlefield. Nuff said. Number 12, the Krumm curved barrel. So what do you do when you're at war and a pesky corner's in the way? Or how about when you really need to shoot over an obstacle but you don't want to be seen? Well, it's the Krumm curved barrel to the rescue. The Krumm was an attachment that featured a curved barrel, and this design deviated drastically from those boring old straight firearms. Because the barrel was curved, it allowed the shooter to fire around corners or over obstacles without exposing themselves to the enemy. There were several variations, including a 30-degree upward curve, a 30-degree downward curve, and a 90-degree curve for firing around corners. The Krumm was the brainchild of Nazi Germany, of course. It was invented by German engineer Dr. Gustav A. Hayden in 1943, and the word Krumm actually translates from German to English as curved barrel, so there wasn't much creativity in the name. The design, however, well, the design had creativity and innovation in spades. The Krumm was designed to be attached to the Sturmgewehr, which was one of the world's first assault rifles. It was also the rifle widely used by German soldiers. It was a complex design and even featured mirrors or periscope sights to help the shooter aim more accurately, and apparently the sights compensated for the trajectory of the bullets. The bullets were deflected by the curve, of course, so the sights were needed to make sure the bullets still hit their target. However, the Krumm had a few major drawbacks: reduced accuracy, increased recoil, and the rapid barrel wear because of the stress placed on the metal by the curve. They were all cons to the gun. It was prone to malfunctions too, which is not really something you want in a rifle, as well as overheating, which is also something you don't really want in a rifle. Plus, it was very expensive and time-consuming to manufacture. As such, the weapon only saw limited production and was pretty much only utilized by a specialized unit in specific urban assaults. Ultimately, the Krumm was one of the weapons that's good on paper, but not so much in practice. Number 11, the Goliath Demolition Tank. Oh, I love the name of this one. If we're giving out prizes for the cutest, most unusual weapons, then this adorable little tank would win hands down. The Goliath Demolition Tank was basically a small, remote-controlled vehicle that looks like a tiny tank. It's also known as the Doodle Bug. Even its nickname is cute. The Goliath demolition tank was mostly used for demolitions and mine-clearing operations, and it was developed by the German company Borgward in 1942, so it's another unusual World War II weapon. The Germans saw the need for a remote-controlled weapon that could carry out super dangerous tasks without putting any German lives on the line, and this is what they came up with. The Goliath had two models, the SD-KFC 302 and 303. The 302 version was powered electrically using lead-acid batteries and could carry up to 130 pounds of explosives. The 303 was powered by a gas engine and could carry up to 220 pounds of explosives. It measured about 5 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and about 1.5 feet tall, and it was controlled via a joystick connected by a 3-wire cable, which allowed the operators to steer it and detonate the explosives. Just like a remote-controlled car toy, except that it carried explosives and was a wartime weapon. It was used on the eastern and western fronts, and it did all sorts of things. It could be driven under bridges and used strategically to take down structures. It could be used to detonate mines from a safe distance. It could be steered into enemy bunkers or trenches and cause some pretty hefty damage. But despite all its uses, the Doodlebug did have some drawbacks. It had pretty thin armor, so it was vulnerable to small arms fire. It could basically be shot at, and it had a pretty limited range due to mostly its control cable. Also, the cable was often cut off during operations, and it struggled on rough terrain, so sometimes it couldn't even get to its targets. And of course, it was expensive to produce, and every penny counts during war, so they couldn't produce very many of them. So although the Goliath was crazy cute and it seemed like a fantastic idea, it was just actually unsuccessful in combat. At the end of the day, this little itty-bitty baby tank was just a little bit too vulnerable for the harsh realities of war. Number 10. Pandrum. If you like your weapons in wheel form, then the Pandrum's got you covered. This bizarre weapon is basically a massive rocket-propelled, explosive-laden wheel. It was designed for beach landings during World War II. Now, the mastermind behind this weapon was British Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. Sounds like an awesome place to work. The project was led by naval officer Neville Shute Norway, who was better known as the novelist Neville Shute. Well, perhaps he should have stuck to penning books, because the Pandrum consisted of two large wheels that were connected by a central drum. The drum was filled with explosives, and to move the weapon, rockets were fixed onto it. The idea was that the rockets would propel the drum forward at really high speeds towards the enemy, and then the explosive power of the device would create a breach in the enemy defenses, thus allowing Allied troops to land more safely on the beach. The weapon underwent testing in 1944, and it was mostly notable during its Dieppe raid. However, the Pandrum's tests were largely unsuccessful. During the raid, it veered wildly off course, becoming uncontrollable, and it missed its mark. Instead, it ended up exploding harmlessly on the beach. Well, the project was abandoned shortly after, and looks like a big wheel filled with explosives propelled by rockets wasn't such a good idea after all. Who knew? Number 9. Explosive rats. Alright, we had bats, and now we've got explosive rats. Well, as a weapon, they hail from World War II, of course, a time when experimental weapons were coming out of the woodwork. Now, the rats weren't live, they were dead rats, so perhaps there is some solace in that. Or does it make it even more weird? Well, the verdict's still out on that. In any case, the weapon was developed by the British Special Operations Executive, or SOE. They took corpses of rats and filled them with explosives. The idea was to carry the explosive-filled rat corpses and use them to sabotage enemy infrastructures, with a special focus on factories and other industrial-type facilities. Here's how it worked. They would scatter the dead rats in various unassuming areas where the presence of dead rats was the norm, areas like boiler rooms, storage areas, etc. The plan hinged on unsuspecting workers or personnel finding the dead rats and then moving them to other areas to dispose of them. The hope was that the dead rats would be disposed of in areas that would cause a lot of structural damage once they exploded. Once brought to these locations, the rats would detonate and chaos and destruction would ensue. Well, exploding rats were part of a broader strategy to use and engage in unconventional and covert methods of warfare. Stuffing dead rats with explosives and planting them in factories, yeah, that's pretty unconventional. There's not much evidence, however, to suggest that this particular tactic was very effective. In fact, there's not much evidence to show that it was used very often. There is evidence to show, though, that it was a real weapon, and it certainly fits the bill when it comes to unusual weapons. And perhaps a tad bit unethical, too. Number 8. The Puckle Gun. Ever wonder what the earliest form of a machine gun was? Well, it was called the Puckle Gun. It was an early attempt at a multi-shot weapon, and it's often considered one of the earliest forms of a machine gun. This unusual weapon was designed by James Puckle, who was both a British inventor and a lawyer in 1718, so it's a pretty old weapon. Puckle saw the need for a firearm that could provide rapid and sustained firepower, especially in naval warfare, so he just whipped up the Puckle Gun. It was large and heavy. It was mounted on a tripod that resembled a small cannon, and it featured a manually operated mechanism that allowed it to fire multiple rounds in quick succession. It featured interchangeable cylinders. Now, these cylinders could be loaded with different types of ammunition, including both round and square bullets, and the Puckle was pretty proud of his gun. He claimed that the gun boasted the ability to fire multiple rounds without needing to reload it, so it was ideal for defense during naval engagements. However, despite the innovative design and Puckle's bragging, the Puckle Gun was never really widely adopted. A few prototypes were produced, but it really never caught on. It failed to attract interest from any military buyers, and the gun had a pretty complex design, so that could have been a turnoff. It also had a relatively slow rate of fire, at least compared to contemporary firearms, and it looked really strange. Puckle was probably just ahead of his time with this one, because over time, rapid-fire weapons caught on like wildfire, although they're far less clunky looking today. Moving on to number 7, the Scissor Katar. The Scissor Katar took the traditional Katar daggers and upped the ante. Instead of featuring just one blade, like an ordinary dagger, the Scissor Katar, or the Katar Scissors as it's also called, featured 2 parallel blades. The name comes from the fact that the 2 parallel blades are hinged at the handles, so they, of course, resemble a pair of scissors. It's believed to have been developed during the 18th or 19th century. This weapon was designed as a close-quarters combat weapon, so it was meant to be used in hand-to-hand or self-defense. The dual-blade design was really unusual for its time, and it allowed the user to deliver multiple strikes or slashes with a single motion. So you basically get twice the bang for the same buck. The blades were typically curved and they were really sharp along the edges. This allowed them to inflict deep and potentially lethal wounds to the opponent, and sharpened along the inner edges too. This allowed them to inflict really deep and potentially lethal wounds to an opponent. But as deadly as this weapon is, it is also a work of beauty. The handle was often elaborately decorated with intricate designs, and they reflected the traditions of the regions where the weapon was made. Some even had ornate metalwork, engraved patterns, and gemstone inlays. So the scissor guitar had a lot of cultural significance, not just as a weapon, but also as a symbol of status or prestige. It was mostly used by warriors and guards, but it also found its way into martial arts. It was nice and compact, so it was a good weapon of choice in confined spaces like crowded marketplaces or narrow streets, or anywhere else you might need to unleash the wrath of the decorative dual blades that is the scissor guitar. Number 6. The Wakka. Who needs the eye of the tiger when you have its claw? The Wakka, also known as the tiger's claw, is an unusual and unconventional weapon that originated from the Indian subcontinent. It's a handheld weapon that resembles the claw of a tiger, hence its nickname. It's most often associated with Indian martial arts, and one look at this thing, and needless to say, it's not something you'd want to encounter. It consists of a metal or wooden handle with curved blades attached to it. Now, these blades are typically sharpened along their inner edge, so the user can slash and tear at their opponent just like a real tiger. The blades and their designs are deliberately fashioned after tiger claws, so the weapon is meant to conjure up the fear that would come from an actual tiger attack. So it's not just about the actual physical weapon, but also about the intimidation factor. The Wakka is often used in raking or slashing motions because that's the way to inflict the most damage to your opponent. The weapon holds a special place in Indian martial arts and folklore because it's associated with strength and valor, courage, and terror. It's mostly used as a defensive weapon, especially in close-quarter combat and unarmed combat techniques, and needless to say, it's a far cry from other more popular handheld weapons like swords. Its unique design and feline inspiration veers the Wakka towards more the unusual sides of weaponry. Number 5. Golf Ball Grenade. You're not likely to hear the word "for" when this golf ball comes at you. Why? Because tossing this golf ball wouldn't be an accident. It's a grenade. The golf ball grenade was developed by the British military, of course, those crazy Brits, during World War II. Apparently, they saw the need for a smaller grenade that looked completely innocuous. Well, a golf ball fit that bill. It was designed to be stealthy and covert, a means of delivering an explosive. They went through great lengths to make sure the grenade actually looked like a real golf ball, and it consisted of a hollow metal sphere which was roughly the same size and weight of a standard golf ball, but this little baby was filled with high explosives. It was also equipped with a fuse mechanism, and the exterior was carefully painted to mimic a golf ball, complete with dimples to truly disguise the explosive goodness hiding inside. This way it could be hidden amongst real golf balls or other objects without raising any suspicion. In environments where conventional weapons might easily be detected, this one would slip through the cracks. It was all about stealth and surprise, since it was primarily used by British commando units and special forces. They brought their balls to clandestine operations behind enemy lines, and because it was small, lightweight, and looked like an ordinary golf ball, it could be deployed before anyone was the wiser. And despite the fact that it did exactly what it was supposed to do, look like a golf ball and not a grenade, it had one pretty significant drawback. It had a small explosive payload. It really didn't offer much bang. Apparently, you can only stuff so many explosives into a golf ball. Furthermore, it needed precise handling and placement, so although it was handy in situations where someone needed to conceal a grenade, it didn't really pack much of a punch. It does, however, highlight the ingenuity and resourcefulness of military engineers during wartime, so it's got that going for it too, which is nice. Number 4. The Harmonica Gun. The Harmonica Gun, for those who want to play a tune while they take a break from shooting. Well, no, not really. Despite its uncanny likeness to a harmonica and its name, the Harmonica Gun, it doesn't actually play any music. Also known as a slide gun, it's a unique form of firearm. It features a breech loaded with a steel slide that contains multiple chambers. Now, the chambers are, of course, filled with projectiles or bullets, and now, surprised to learn that this weapon was actually pretty popular. It came in a whole bunch of different varieties. Most of these harmonica guns used percussion cap mechanisms. Now, in these percussion cap guns, each chamber holds a separate primer, powder charge, and projectile. The slide is inserted into an opening in the breech action and can be advanced by releasing the cam lock. This allows for the manual movement of the slide by hand, and while the percussion cap gun were the most popular, there were variations. For example, some designs included compressed air guns and models that utilized pinfire cartridges. These harmonica guns were also available in both pistol and rifle models, and they came in single-action and double-action configurations. They've been kicking around for a while. One of the earliest examples of a harmonica gun dates back to 1742. This gun is credited to the Swiss inventor Welton, but he didn't have the patent. The patent didn't really come around until 1814, when James Thompson patented a flintlock harmonica gun. From there, the lineage of these guns gets a little murky, with several people claiming that they invented it. But despite all this, the real father of the harmonica gun is widely believed to be Jonathan Browning. He started crafting harmonica guns in 1834, along with more conventional rifles. In any case, although there's some convention over who the real inventor was, the harmonica gun does remain a fascinating relic of the past, albeit an unusual one. Number 3. Dummy paratroopers. Sometimes a weapon isn't just about the pain or injury it can inflict. Sometimes it's about more than that. For example, a weapon that disorients or confuses can be just as effective as one that maims, depending on what the real goal is. It's clear that during war, creativity and weaponry is pushed to its boundaries. There's more than the need to just attack, there's also the need to divert, and that's really what this weapon is all about. Dummy paratroopers might not look like much at first glance, but these things were actually a highly effective weapon used to confuse and divert the enemy. And you better believe they took a lot of careful planning to pull off, so props for that. Dummy paratroopers were decoy mannequins that were dropped out of planes during World War II. Now, these mannequins were dressed up in military uniforms, so at a distance they looked like actual soldiers. They were also known as Ruperts. These dummy paratroopers were deployed by Allied forces. They were meant to confuse or mislead enemy forces, especially during airborne operations. A lot of time and energy went into creating them, and they were typically made of canvas, wood, or other lightweight material. They were carefully designed to look like real people. And they were even dressed in authentic military uniforms, complete with helmets and weapons, and some of them even had radios that emitted fake radio chatter. The goal was to create the illusion of large-scale airborne assault, and this would distract the enemy and divert their resources away from the actual drop zones. But surely the enemy wasn't that stupid, right? Surely they could tell a real person from a canvas dummy? Well, here's where it gets really inventive. The dummies were designed to mimic the posture and silhouette of real parachuters. They often had articulated joints so they could be posed in lifelike positions, and their uniforms had an enormous amount of detail, right down to the insignia. So from a distance, these dummies really did look like real people. In fact, they worked so well they played a huge role in several key operations during World War II. For example, they were used in Operation Bodyguard, which was an Allied deception campaign leading up to the D-Day landings in Normandy. During this campaign, the dummies were dropped into various locations across France, and this confused the Germans and successfully diverted their attention away from the actual invasion sites. So yeah, Ruperts for the win. Number 2. The active denial system. So there are times when a large crowd can get a little out of hand, and when that happens, the police are called in there to get the crowd under control. Now, there are many ways to quell an unruly crowd: chemical agents, kinetic force, good old-fashioned hoses. But this next weapon takes a different approach: radiation. Because come on, what's a better way to disperse a crowd than to make them run for the hills because they feel like their flesh is melting off their faces? Well, that's the theory behind the active denial system, or the ADS for short. The ADS is a non-lethal weapon that was developed by the United States military for crowd control. Its emphasis is on non-lethal here. It's also known as the pain ray or the heat ray, which doesn't sound that pleasant. The active denial system employs directed energy in the form of millimeter wave electromagnetic radiation to induce a sensation of intense heat on the skin of individuals within its range. What? What does that mean? Well, in layman's terms, it's a weapon that makes you feel like your face is burning off. Now, the system works by emitting a focused beam. This beam is focused onto a target like an unruly crowd. It penetrates the outer layer of skin, reaching a depth of a few millimeters, and from there the radiation interacts with the nerve endings in your face and your heat-sensitive receptors called nociceptors. From there, the radiation interacts with the nerve endings in your face and your heat-sensitive receptors. The beam stimulates these receptors, causing a sensation of intense heat. So yeah, your face really isn't on fire, it just feels like it is. The sensation is enough to make you stop whatever you're doing, which is exactly what the authorities need to do to get the crowd under control. The ADS is designed to be highly directional and precise. It allows an operator to target specific individuals or an entire area within a crowd. It can be operated remotely or manually by trained personnel, and it doesn't cause any real harm or injuries, so it is an effective way to disperse a crowd. But like all good weapons, the ADS has been met with some controversy. There are concerns about its potential for misuse or abuse. The system requires further testing to better understand what it's actually capable of and what its limitations are. So as it stands, even though it's pretty ingenious, its deployment has been really limited. Number 1. The Pigeon Guided Missile. Psychologist B.F. Skinner has had his fair share of infamy and controversy when it came to his test subjects and the tests he was performing. However, unbeknownst to many, he also dabbled in weaponry invention. Behold the Pigeon-Guided Missile, a weapon that's so unusual it's kinda hard to wrap your mind around. So what was it? Well, the idea behind pigeon-guided missiles was to train pigeons to peck at targets on a screen inside the missile. This pecking would then steer the missile toward the intended destination. Alright, I feel some red flags coming on here. Pigeon-guided missiles were part of a project called Project Pigeon. It's clever, but it's also known as Project Orcon, which was the abbreviation for Organic Control. The project was first proposed in 1943, and Skinner believed the pigeons could be trained to peck at the screens. He based this belief on the principles of operant conditioning, which is just a fancy way of saying animal mind control. Basically, the animals are trained to perform specific tasks, like the screen pecking, through reinforcement. To test the idea, Skinner had his team conducting experiments with pigeons placed inside simulated cockpit environments. The pigeons were trained to peck at targets on a screen in response to visual cues. With food rewards provided as the reinforcement for correct responses, the experiment showed promising results, with the pigeons demonstrating an ability to effectively guide simulated missiles towards targets. Well, that's great. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out there were quite a few skeptics. They pointed out that the pigeons might be a tad bit on the unreliable side, since they were pigeons. Also, more advanced guidance technologies were being developed, things like radar and electronic guidance systems, and some skeptics believe that those systems might have a hand up on the pigeons pecking at screens. Turns out they were right. Project Pigeon was discontinued in 1944, and Skinner's idea of using pigeons to guide missiles never progressed beyond the experimental. But Skinner's legacy does live on today. The theory of pigeon-guided missiles still holds a place in the history books, mostly under the topic of the most unusual weapons ever created. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time. Thank you to our channel members.